Live, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal. I'm Emily Galvan-Almanza. In a pair of special elections for the US Senate last week, Georgians were faced with a choice. It would decide the fate of the nation for the next 2 years, at least. And that choice was between re-electing the incumbent Republican senators David Perdue and Kelly Loeffler, or sending their Democratic challengers, Jon Ossoff and Raphael Warnock, to Washington instead. Well, we all know what happened. Democrats pulled a clean sweep. They ousted both incumbents. They reclaimed control of the Senate majority, albeit by a very narrow margin. And that will be a Senate majority held by Democrats for the first time since 2014. Now, I am very excited to be joined by our guest today to talk about how that happened and what's going to happen next. Nse Ufot, CEO of the New Georgia Project, an organization that led efforts to register and turn out Black voters in the elections. Nse, I'm so thrilled you're joining us. Thank you so much for being here.
Hello, thank you for having me.
So, all right, I'd like to begin by giving our viewers a little bit of background. Can you explain what was on the line in these elections for Georgia voters and especially for Black women in Georgia?
I think that there was so much on the line. The way that we train our organizers and our canvassers and our volunteers is that they have twice as many ears as they do mouths, right? And so that it is important before we even enter into a conversation about why it's important that they register or show up to vote in this moment, what is it that they care about? And so overwhelmingly, COVID-19 was at the top of Georgians' minds, particularly Black women, across age, across race, across geography. Now, the little difference that we did see was COVID as an economic issue is how men identify the issue. So housing, right? We are headed towards an eviction crisis, unemployment, and how that has had an impact on Black communities. And for women and femmes, it was COVID as a healthcare issue, right? How do I keep myself safe? How do I keep my family safe, et cetera? As we got closer to election day, it shouldn't surprise anyone that the $2,000 aid check absolutely shot to the top of the list, particularly for young Georgians, and manifested itself in a campaign that we like to call Mitch Better Have My Money.
I saw that. I love
that. So COVID, again, as a healthcare issue, as an economic issue, and then the COVID relief, the stimulus, and the politics of it, and the cynicism of it also was at the top of voters' minds.
Yeah, no, I did notice toward the end there, the Republican incumbents taking a position much closer to Bernie Sanders than Mitch McConnell, which was an interesting twist. Yeah. But speaking of the incumbents and their positions, I've heard people say that Georgia was not, in fact, a red state, but a voter-suppressed state. And I'd love to have you tell us about what Republicans like David Perdue and Kelly Loeffler or Donald Trump or Brian Kemp and all of them have done to disenfranchise Black voters in Georgia. And I think where that may have reflections for other states as well. What did organizers have to overcome on that front? And what might they have to overcome elsewhere?
Right. So I'll say this. I'll say that Georgia has a long and a recent history of voter suppression. So let's just focus on the 9 weeks between the general election and the January runoffs. Georgia voters overcame a reduction in the number of early voting days, a reduction in the number of early voting locations and election day voting locations, a reduction in the number of drop boxes where Georgians could drop off their absentee ballots. Georgians, and I should also say an attempt to limit the number of hours that the drop boxes were available. The idea that they should only be able to drop off their ballots and drop boxes during the time where the county boards of elections are open, which defies how drop boxes are used in any other business case. The whole point is that it's after hours access, right? Georgia voters saw the Secretary of State release a sort of a guidance, I guess, if you will, a week before the election, 2 weeks before the election, to say that individuals or organizations like ours who engaged in line warming activity, right, handing out bottles of water, handing out slices of pizza, hand warmers, if they did any of that, that they would be subject to a criminal investigation and face possible criminal penalties. And then on top of all of that, the sort of rampant disinformation that voters were being fed from as high up as the President of the United States. And so those are the waters in which we swim. And those are the things, the hurdles that Georgia voters have to overcome, which makes last Tuesday's election results that much more remarkable.
Can I just ask, as a criminal defense lawyer myself, like, if you're handing out pizza to a line of, like, what's the crime? What's the crime they're going to charge you with?
So apparently it is like election interference, electioneering within 150 feet of a polling location. Right.
All right. So you have to park the food truck like down the block.
Right. Now, let me be very clear. This is on par. This is on point. This is in the spirit in which our last two secretaries of state have approached this issue, that they are no strangers to using their platform to try to have a chilling effect on the work of grassroots organizations and voter registration organizations like ours, like Fair Fight, like Black Voters Matter, et cetera, that using their investigative powers to drain us of our resources, to cast a pall over us and the work that we do, to impugn our credibility with our constituents, is very much a tactic that they employ.
Okay, so you're in this landscape where it seems like you can get prosecuted for like being on the wrong part of the block or saying the wrong thing or talking to the wrong person, and you're dealing with a behemoth of an opposition. Right. Just to clarify for our voters, your work, well, let me take a step back here, because I want to know, in this context of enormous opposition and enormous, what it sounds like, danger for your organization and your peer organizations, how did you make the game plan, and what was the game plan for those days from the general to the runoff?
Right. Well, that was a factor in our game plan. Like this was a moment to not be precious. Like this was a moment to not, we organize in the world as it is and not necessarily in the world as it should be. I would love for us to be able to talk about how important voting is and how important our democracy is and how we all have to participate free of, this sort of sword hanging over our heads. But that's not the world that we live in. And so this very much was a factor into our game plan. When we are making our campaign plans, the idea is, how do we have overwhelming participation, so much so that despite all that they will throw at us, that the will of the people will still be reflected in the results of our elections. And so we are going to every corner of the state. We're registering eligible but unregistered people to vote. That's why, instead of going directly into GOTV mode after the November general and after we finished curing ballots and after Georgia was called for President-elect Biden and for the Biden-Harris ticket, that we went back to registering people to vote. So I think, what hasn't made the news and what people don't know is that about 33,000 new Georgians registered to vote after the November general. About 14,000 of them were young Georgians of color, and New Georgia Project registered 7,000 of them, right? So in the 30 days between the November general being called and the December 7th voter registration deadline. And so, it's labor intensive, it's resource intensive, and it was absolutely worth it.
So are there estimates that when I think of the two kind of different things you just described, curing ballots and registering voters, curing ballots is like a one election thing. You have cured that ballot in that context, in that moment. But registering young voters, unless they get purged from the voter rolls, which of course is always a possibility in a voter suppressed state, seems like something that would last. Do you have any estimates of the impact that those registrations could have long term for politics in Georgia?
So I don't have a number to put on it yet, and but I will though, absolutely soon. What I can tell you is that there's nothing more powerful than seeing your vote, your one vote, flip a state, right? We spent, the better part of 9 months researching our messaging, researching how we talk to young people and people of color, focus groups, polling, A/B message testing, surveys on the door, all of that. And I don't know if anything that we have said will have the same impact as the idea that out of 5 million people, 11,000 people decided the election in Georgia. That for the 9 weeks between the November general and the January runoffs, we saw celebrities and influencers all offer encouraging messages to Georgia voters about, how the country needs them right now, and people doing really awful takes on Georgia on my mind. And I loved every bit of it, The great ones that were done by like Broadway stars to like, John Legend sitting at his table being super cool to, the one that I did that wasn't so great.
I'm really encouraged to know that you did one too, and I'm totally going to go look for it after the show. All right. So when you talked about the problems with the drop boxes,
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking a lot about what had happened in Texas during the general election, right? When there was so much dispute over like a county with 100 people having the same number of drop boxes as a county with 4 million people. So as I reflect on other states that have dealt with some of the same tactics of suppression that Georgia has, do you think that your model is exportable to other Southern states?
Absolutely. There's nothing sort of magical about what we built in Georgia. We're already in sort of deep communication and a deep relationship with similar like-minded organizations in North Carolina, in Alabama, and in Mississippi. I think that there is a sort of recognition that one, demographics are absolutely at play here as people empty out New York City. Sorry, guys, and move south for better weather, for economic opportunities. Political scientists and demographers are calling it the reversal of the Great Migration. So the Great Migration between the 1920s and the 1970s, Black Americans fled the South, right? Fleeing racialized violence and seeking economic opportunities, which is why so many African Americans in Chicago can trace their roots to, Mississippi. So many African Americans in New York and New Jersey trace their roots to the Carolinas and to Georgia. And now those folks are moving home, or their children are moving home. And so they're not just moving to Atlanta, they're moving to places across the South. And so, you look at a state like Mississippi, where it by far has the highest percentage of Black residents. Nearly 40% of the people who live in Mississippi are African American. And so the idea is, where are you investing? Where are you organizing? I think historically, both parties have treated Black voters as a sort of mobilization universe, right? So you don't have to persuade them. There's a difference between a persuasion universe and a mobilization. Persuasion universe, you're spending time, you talk to them earlier, you talk to them, you persuade them why they should vote for your candidate, why they should volunteer, why they should give money. There's an ongoing conversation that is meaningful, that is substantive. And a mobilization universe is, come on guys, you know what it is, go vote. And we're not going to tell you who to vote for, because there's an assumption that you're already going to vote for us. And so I think thinking about young voters and voters of color as a persuasion universe. And sometimes it's about the candidate, but sometimes it's about whether or not it's even worth it to vote. We registered 18,000 18-year-olds in 2018. I will never forget it, in part because of the alliteration, but in part because of what happened afterwards, right? Parkland High School on February 14th, 2018, there's a school shooting, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. And, in the midst of all of the grief, we started to get tons of phone calls from PTA parents, from SGA students. Like, I want to do a voter registration drive. Can New Georgia Project come to our lunch period and register us to vote? Because we want to get the gun laws changed in Georgia, and we want to vote for governor. And so we registered 18,000 18-year-olds in 2018, and they were so excited to vote for Stacey Abrams. And then they watched while the election was stolen and no one was held accountable. And we had to then work to try to get them back, to persuade them that it was worth it to even participate in our Georgia elections. And those are not conversations that you can start after Labor Day if you want it to have a meaningful impact on turnout.
So I know that this effort, it sounds like in order for this to work, you need a lot of like all hands on deck. You need a lot of mobilization, a lot of resources. And when we look more broadly at the geographic South, I'm wondering if you could share with us some other organizers or groups. I mean, you are like the all-star of this. Who are folks we might not have heard of, who are also working on this, who we should be paying attention to with upcoming elections?
Right. My brother Marcus Bass in North Carolina, who has Nse Votes, a really sort of powerful, impactful organization. Arika Bennett in Mississippi with an organization called Mississippi Votes. Love her, love the work that they're doing. Our sister DeWanna Thompson in Alabama with Woke Vote. There are some folks, Voices of the Experienced, which works and organizes formerly incarcerated folks in Louisiana and across the South. People who are getting their rights restored and re-entering into society as full citizens. So Voices of the Experience is VOTE is an acronym. I get really upset because I'm like, oh, that's so good. It's so good. How did I not think of that? But yeah, New Virginia Majority in Virginia, we have good, deep relationships with the folks. New Florida Majority, and they have since merged with another organization, and they're calling themselves Florida Rising. And so, yeah, that there are base building, membership based, values aligned, progressive organizations across the South that are doing this work and are tilling the soil and becoming a political and an organizing home for the progressive majority.
So speaking of all stars of the movement, I'm pretty sure I would put money on there being somewhere someone who has already asked the Pope for the beatification of Stacey Abrams.
Like,
there is such a thing as a beatification.
Email is on its way. For sure.
Yeah. And the thing about when you hear from Stacey Abrams that I think is so phenomenal is I don't think I've ever heard her talk about the work without talking about teamwork and talking about, I don't think I've ever heard her accept credit for herself. She orients that credit on the larger movement. And I'm wondering if you could just talk about what that means for someone who is so iconic and sort of has become a symbol of this movement to keep pushing the viewer's eye back towards the movement itself.
Right. I think it's because that she operates with like an incredible amount of integrity. But I also think it's because she has an eye on winning. Right. And like actual wins, not like moral victories, how we win, how we build on those wins, and how we defend those wins beyond one election cycle. And part of that is that you have to tell the truth. You have to tell the truth about how this gets built. Stacey will tell you that like we don't elect messiahs. And so I think that there is a sort of natural desire to like find out who the leader is, right? I think that that's why in the early days of Black Lives Matter, press and others were so frustrated, right? Because unlike the civil rights movement of the past, right, of the 1960s, there wasn't a like well-dressed, hyper-articulate pastor that was out in front of the movement, right? That it was leaderful. Like people tried to say it was leaderless, it's leaderful. And so I think that, it wasn't until I was very much a full-time organizer that I learned about Bayard Rustin, and the role that he played in organizing the March on Washington, right? That it wasn't until I was adult that I learned about the role that the United Auto Workers played in the March on Washington, and that there were no women speakers, but it doesn't mean that there were no women organizers. And so I think that a leader like Stacey has learned lessons from the past and really wants us to win. And it starts by telling the truth about how previous victories were achieved and how we can build on top of that. If the world just thought that you had to have a Stacey Abrams in your state in order to achieve the kind of victories that we're experiencing in Georgia, then Mississippi would be foreclosed because her family left Mississippi in the 90s and Mississippi's loss was Georgia's gain, right? But that the truth of the matter is that they're investing in the infrastructure by being honest about who it is that you're trying to move, who is it that we're trying to bring in, who's being left out of the conversation, who's not in the room, who's not at the table, by acknowledging the hurdles that are in place, right? And factoring that into your campaigning by resourcing these indigenous leaders, these people who are already doing this work as their 5 to 9, right? That they have a 9 to 5 that feeds them.
I like that.
Right.
Yeah.
And then they're block captains, they are active in their sororities, they're active in their churches, their synagogues, and resourcing them to continue to do the work that they've done. Like, again, that is, I think, Stacey's gift. That's how she distinguishes herself as a leader, is radical honesty about what it took to get here and what we need to prepare for on the road ahead.
So speaking of radical honesty, this was a really interesting election for the media because it was an election that was going to break a lot of norms in the general. And a lot of the information, predictions, coverage that was happening in the South, for the first time in recent memory, I think really robustly, began to talk about voter suppression. When we would see the footage of lines of people, there was a lot less rah, rah, America, look how great it is that people are willing to stand in line for 8 hours, and a lot more, this is what voter suppression looks like, is people standing in line for 8 hours. Obviously, this was imperfect, but I'm wondering if the sort of attempt by the media to cover in a different way, if you thought that had an influence on what happened in this election cycle.
Absolutely. I think that the story that we tell about ourselves, about our movement, about our democracy, about our elections are absolutely important. And all we have to do is look at the disinformation that has addled the brains of a lot of Americans, and particularly those who mounted a deadly insurrection at our Capitol last Wednesday. But yeah, radical honesty, telling the truth about this moment that we're in. And I mean, the truth of the matter is that all Americans don't have to prove their patriotism by standing in line for 8 hours, 11 hours, as we saw in Georgia, in order to exercise their right to vote. Only voters of color have had to do that. And so we all welcomed that shift in narrative towards sort of a more honest depiction of what was happening. And again, a lot of that can be attributed to the 2018 gubernatorial election in Georgia, but also a recognition of the 2016 elections and the results of them, and the real cost to our democracy of shutting out a significant portion of our population. We are weaker when our democracy and our elections infrastructure is attacked like that, where there's a significant portion of the population who's foreclosed from participating, that we have leaders who are not accountable and they don't feel like they have to be because it wasn't actually all of the people that sent them there.
So obviously this is a huge victory. But I have gleaned from talking to you for about 20 minutes that your focus just does not seem to be on the past. It seems to be on what's next. So I'd love for you to share, what you're going to take from this with you into the next thing, what is next for you, and what you would like to see in this sector more generally moving forward to keep the momentum going.
Well, first, I'm going to take a nap and a vacation because the traditional launch of the New Georgia Project sort of activist year, our organizing year, is MLK weekend. And so, that's when we started in 2020, and it didn't end until last Friday. I will say that the legislative session for Georgia has started today. And the Republicans have used a bullhorn to announce their intentions to impanel a committee to investigate Georgia's election integrity issues. I guarantee you that the way that they define election integrity issues are very different than the way that we would. And so I suspect that we are probably going to start the year in defensive mode and making sure that their plans to cut vote by mail, no fault vote by mail, are not successful. I think the part that's particularly egregious about that is while vote by mail was a solution that a lot of states adopted because we're in the middle of a pandemic, we're in the middle of a crisis, Republicans in Georgia passed vote by mail, no fault absentee balloting in 2005. And so literally, this is how Georgians have been voting for 15 years. And it is only now that they've decided that it's problematic and they want to get rid of it. I think that going into the legislative session, just a reminder that they haven't expanded Medicaid in Georgia, that we have 9 hospitals in the rural parts of the state that have closed. And not only is COVID on the rise, not only are we way behind in distributing vaccines, but people are still having babies. People are still fighting cancer. Hospitals tend to be the largest employer in communities where they are. And so losing 9 hospitals is devastating. And there are more on the chopping block. And so we have to expand Medicaid in our state. The minimum wage in Georgia is $5.15. We believe that we are going to have to be the left flank for the Biden-Harris administration because that student loan jubilee that they're talking about, we want to make sure that that's real because that's the message that we knocked on doors with, right? Mm-hmm. Expanding Medicaid, right? The additional protections to the Affordable Care Act, the BREATHE Act. And so the BREATHE Act, criminal legal reform, so that there are consequences for what happened to Ahmaud Arbery, where they held videotape evidence of his murder for 74 days. That there are consequences about what happened to Breonna Taylor and these no-knock warrants and the impact that they are having in transitioning communities, gentrifying communities. Et cetera. So there's a lot on Georgians' minds, and our newly elected Senators Warnock and Ossoff are going to hear about it.
And say that was such a wonderful summary of like everything that I think is on a lot of people's minds, even nationwide. I think we're going to be hearing a lot more about the polling that's coming out on some of the topics you mentioned that is very strong and actually some surprising bipartisan support for a lot of the changes you just mentioned. So I'm really, really excited to have had you here today. And just like personally, I want to really, really thank you for all of the work you did.
I forgot about the John Lewis Voting Rights Restoration Act.
Oh my goodness, we talk about that. Let's go long. Talk about that. What is that thing? Tell our viewers.
Yeah. So I live in Georgia's 5th Congressional District. I used to be represented by the dearly departed John Lewis. I am now proudly represented by my friend, Representative Nikema Williams. And so the House has passed HR 1, there's a lot of support for it. And the idea is that 2013 Shelby versus Holder, the Supreme Court case that punched the Voting Rights Act in the gut and got rid of sections 4 and sections 5, these sort of pre-clearance sections, which mean basically if you have a history of making it difficult for Black people and people of color to vote, in order to change laws, you got to get approval by the federal government, by a federal judge or by the Department of Justice. And I would argue that this entire country has a history of voter suppression targeting people of color and women, and that there should be a universal standard, that pre-clearance should be a universal standard. And that is at the heart, that's the spirit of the Voting Rights Restoration Act. That is now named after John Lewis. Again, it's been passed by the House, and now it is up to the Senate. Senator McConnell refused to bring it forward for a vote. I don't think that the new majority leader Schumer is going to adopt the same position. And I think that a lot of that has to do with voters from Georgia's 5th congressional district who delivered them to new members to their caucus. So we're very excited about that. I don't think that it's going to be easy. So while I am full of hope, I also have my work boots and my work gloves on the ready.
Take a nap first. Take a few days off. I'm going to hold you to the nap and vacation part you mentioned before, because it sounds like you might just plow right through that with your work boots on. And so you are a national inspiration. Thank you so much for joining us here today on The Appeal Live. It's been a joy.
This was lovely. Thank you so much. Yes, thank you.
Well, for our viewers to wrap up, despite generations of voter suppression targeted at Black communities by people like Brian Kemp and others, Georgia voters delivered a resounding rejection of these tactics over the last several weeks, first in the November general, and then in the runoffs that we've already forgotten about that just happened last week. The victories by Raphael Warnock and Jon Ossoff have given control of the upper chamber to the Democrats and created a unified Democratic government in Washington. The people most responsible for this historic moment are the Black women who organized and got out the vote on Election Day. And we're so glad to have spent our show talking about that today. That's all the time we have, but you can, of course, join us anytime you want here on The Appeal Live. I'm Emily Galvin Almanza. You can follow The Appeal News on Facebook. You can follow The Appeal on Twitter for all the latest news. Thank you so much for joining us, and we will